Hello everybody and welcome to the Quickstarter guide for the Queen's Gambit declined setup. So after the move 1c4, the Queen's Gambit setup is of course started by the move e6. So whereas the previous part was about the Slav, the move c6, we are now going for e6 with ID d5 and getting the typical Queen's Gambit declined setup. And here the main question for white is the same as in the Slav. The question is whether to develop this bishop towards e2, to play e3, e2 or d3, or to play g3 and fianchetto the bishop to g2. That is really the key question. So one way to play is knight f3, d5, e3. This is really a popular way to play. I have played it quite a lot myself. And it's actually, I would say, fairly critical, just like against the Slav. So as black, for us, it's a matter of choosing how to approach it. One possible way is to go for quite sharp forcing lines, typically with the move c5 at some point very soon. That tends to lead to quite sharp, quite forcing play, but also very often quite, like, let's say, the board gets traded off, gets vacuumed. Like it's so forcing that the lines goes on until there are no more pieces left, more or less. It's also possible to go for other slower setups, which is what I advocate. So, for instance, after knight f6, b3, I'm advocating the setup with b6. And the purpose of the move, we want to play bishop b7, we want to play bishop d6, short castle, knight b7, and then we will see. And this is very solid. This is very similar to, for instance, what I'm recommending in my Magnus Queen's Gambit course against the move 4e3 and also 3e3. Like knight f3, e3 and the 4e3 chapters, you will find this setup very, very frequently. But of course, you don't need to study that specific Queen's Gambit course. I mean, against for all the Queen's Gambit course, I should say this setup makes a lot of sense. It's very similar. You will be well familiar with it, I assume. Also, it doesn't transpose to the Queen's Gambit declined, so it doesn't matter which one you play. Just if you are a student of my course, you will be perhaps a little bit extra familiar with the setup. Bishop b2, bishop b7. And here, the most common thing for white actually is to take on d5, either now or on the previous move. And the point is that after we recapture with the pawn, then in this typical structure, if our pawn was back on b7, we would be very, very solid. We will play c6 and have this typical so-called Carlsbad structure. Whereas now, with the pawn on b6, it's a little bit different. We still capture with the pawn, but we cannot get this most solid of structures with the c6 and b7. Instead, we have to play a little bit differently. Also, we should mention that it could be possible to take with a piece on d5. That we generally do when white has already committed to g3. That's a little bit different. If we take with a piece now, then white plays d4 and puts the bishop on d3, and white will have quite a nice version. So it's important to see what white have played previously for making the choice how to recapture. But here we recapture with the e-pawn. And actually, in this position, it's possible for white to play, for instance, d4, then bishop d3, and so on. That's actually very likely transposing to the Magnus Queen's Gambit, or that sort of setup. We still play this bishop d6, short castle, knight b7, later on maybe knight e4, and so on. Very typical stuff. But for those who play the Reti, there is another move that is actually much more common, and I also think more critical, simply better, to be honest. And that is the move g3. And this, if you see it for the first time, might look a little bit strange to you. Like, after all, white played the move e3 in order to develop the bishop on the other diagonal. But here, things have changed quite a bit in the center. Like, white has taken on d5. We have chosen to take with the e-pawn, which is very important. And we have also played this move b6. So basically what white is trying to say is that at some point, we are quite likely to play... we are quite likely to play c5. And when we play c5, white wants to follow up with d4, and finally this pawn on d5 becomes a little bit of a target. Sorry, we play c5, I should say it in this position, white plays d4, and this becomes a little bit of a target. That's why the bishop makes sense on g2. And our solution for this is quite logical in regards to that. We simply play bishop d6, and we don't play c5. So bishop g2, short castle, short castle. This is very, very common. I think if white plays the move 3 e3, this is a very, very likely position to reach. Here we play rook e8. I mean, we want to play rook e8 and knight bd7. We want to play both moves. It doesn't really make a difference which one we start with. But out of principle, I like to keep the knight on b8 for a while. And that is because sometimes we want to keep the option of going with the knight to c6 as well. Usually white develops with knight c3. Now, due to the possibility of knight b5, we play a6. And here, well, the most logical move is rook c1, after which we finish our development with knight bd7. And this sort of structure, these sort of positions, is something that you must be, or you will be very familiar with throughout the course. It is something that you are very likely to reach in this specific version or in a similar version. But basically, the structure is quite undetermined, which is very, very important. For white, the big question is, how should they treat the d-pawn, basically? Because one way is to play d4. That generally is a little bit more tempting after we have played c5, because then white has the possibility to open up. Finally, this pawn becomes a little bit weak. So if white were to play d4 immediately, we are not playing c5. If white doesn't play d4, if white plays some waiting move, like there are moves like knight e2, rook e1, even d3, many moves are covered actually in the main chapter. If white does any of this, we are preparing slowly. So we are playing moves like rook c8, maybe at some point h6, waiting for white to see how they play. And basically, what we are looking for is a moment later on to play c5, only when after d4 we can play c4 without the pawn ending up weak on c4. So that's why, for instance, we play rook c8. So it's all about this this battle. When white is playing d4, when are we playing c5, and try to get sort of a good version of it. So it's a bit of a waiting game. If white were to play d4, which I think is quite likely to happen in your games, it's also, in my experience, what white players does most often, then we don't play c5. Then we play instead knight e4, for instance. And next up, it's a little bit, it's still very much depending on what white does. We might take on c3. But also the knight can stay on e4 because that's a great square. White don't want to take on e4 because d takes e4 improves our structure. The bishop becomes more active. Also, we get a nice blockading square on d5. And in general, we are still building slowly. Should white decide to play knight e2 to avoid the trade, then a nice way to get counterplay is to play a5, intending a4. And then with the pawn on a4, like we could either play a3, we could maybe open up with a takes b3, depends on circumstances, and also I would say not necessary to make a decision immediately. You can also adapt very much this, let's say, flexible mindset. So basically, this position that you are very likely to reach, it's very much, what you're trying to do very much as black is to be flexible and see how white reacts, and then try to react accordingly. And the dream long-term later on, should you get the chance, especially with the pawn on d4, is this c5, c4 pawn. Once we establish a pawn on c4 safely, then we can continue b5, b4, and then we are doing great. Yeah, it's just a matter of reaching it. And we should definitely not rush, because as soon as we make a pawn move, we have to take into account white putting pressure on our position. So lots of patience necessary, lots of flexibility, but on the other hand, a highly, highly interesting strategic battle. So that's a very, very likely structure to appear in general in many different versions, but it's something we should definitely be very familiar with here. White could also try to play g3 immediately. And this is a little bit different. Because after g3, white has not yet taken on d5, which means that white has a bit more flexibility. And as black, we should actually treat this a little bit differently. And therefore, I recommend the move c5. So if we were to play the same, bishop d6, you can always do this actually if you want to. You can play something like this, short castle, play exactly the same moves as we just saw. Let's say, let's say knight c3, a6. But the problem here is that without this capture, it's a little bit more difficult to get counterplay. White keeps a little bit more flexibility and perhaps slightly more chances to ask us questions. On the other hand, it's still very much a solid setup, and you can still do it. Like this is the worst that will happen to you, then it's not so bad. So if you feel very simplistic, you can definitely go for this setup. But if you want to be a little bit more accurate in the opening phase, if you want to make sure that you have also theoretical equality to the maximum, sort of not giving white anything for free, then I believe the move c5 makes sense. And the idea now, if white takes on d5, we don't take with the pawn, because that would be what we try to avoid. White plays d4, takes on c5, and our pawns are weak. But instead we take with the queen. And this works quite well because now the moves e3 and g3 do not combine too well. We can simply follow up with knight c6, rook d8, put pressure on the d pawn, and white is a little bit slower than usual. So after c5, the most common move is bishop g2. And now again, we don't play bishop d6, which we did in the previous line, because white will take, and we can no longer take with the queen, and also the bishop might be a little bit vulnerable there. So we settle for the more modest bishop e7. Short castle, short castle. Again, the thing to remember here all the time, the same. We always, after c takes d5, recapture with a piece. In this case, most probably the knight or the queen. But the important thing that we recapture with a piece. And that is because we have already committed to c5. So we don't want to take with the pawn. The pawns are ending up weak. And after the move knight c3, we have actually transposed to a very big theoretical line, but one line that, even though there are many games and it's sort of a big line, it still doesn't require a lot of knowledge, because basically it's very unforcing. It's mostly a maneuvering game, both sides playing this quite slowly in many different ways, and I think it's necessary only to know one setup, and that's enough to be fine. And that setup for black that I propose is to move queen to c8. This in itself looks quite odd. Looks like it requires some explanation. But the point is, we have to all the time take into account this capture on d5. Like, this is why this is slightly more tricky for white, because white is keeping more flexibility. And after the capture on d5, we still want to recapture with a piece. So we still want to take with the knight and then with the bishop. We don't want to take with the pawn, because then we are getting weak pawns. That means in this position that knight c6, for instance, is not so good, because it blocks the bishop. Knight bd7 is also a little bit passive, because actually we would like our knight on c6 if we can get it there. Therefore, we move our queen. And our plan with moving the queen is that if white plays queen e2, which is actually how white usually treats this position, improving slowly, trying to bring the rooks, then we play rook d8. And now we can see the point. After, let's say, rook a c1, we do play knight to c6. And what we have achieved now is that if white were to take, knight takes, we can take with the rook. So we still don't have to take with the pawn. And this is really the whole purpose of this move, queen c8. We are able to develop the knight to c6 without having to take back with the pawn on d5. And additionally, in this position, if white does nothing with the knight on c6, we are actually ready to play d4, taking over the center. And that is sort of another dream scenario for us, being able to take over the center with d4. So white actually has to do something. But for instance, take, and rook takes is very, very harmonious. We can play queen d7, rook d8 next. And additionally, another point with the queen on c8, if white is not careful and plays d4, which looks very natural, then bishop a6, and due to the pin, we win an exchange. So, of course, white should not allow that, but it's an important extra advantage of having the queen on c8. So basically, very important, not exactly how you do it, but that you avoid taking back with the pawn on d5 when you have the pawn on c5. So that's the main thing that we need to know in this line. So instead of that, instead of playing with e3, white can also play the move g3, after which we play d5. And here again, white has an important choice of which move to start with. It feels like it shouldn't make a big difference, but actually it's quite an important question. Like, not as important, of course, as to where to put the bishop, because having played g3 is a big commitment. It shows that the bishop will go to g2 no matter what. But here, actually, the question is to start with knight f3 or to start with bishop g2. And our reply in both cases is to take on c4. So we don't want to play knight f6, because then, for instance, after d4, we are reaching a Catalan. I don't know if you have this version of the Catalan as black in your repertoire. In my Magnus Queen's Gambit declined repertoire, it is not there, because we play with an early a6. And additionally, white could also play knight f3. And let's say black plays bishop e7. Then after d4, for instance, the open Catalan is ruled out, and black is quite a lot limited. So we always have to take into account this fact that white might play d4 later on. And that's why we need something independent. One way is to play d4, creating a reversed Benoni structure. But that in general, I believe, is quite complicated practically for black. Like, theoretically, it's quite healthy, but practically, I think that it's quite tricky to handle actually from the black side. So I think much simpler is to take on c4. And by taking now, of course, we rule out the possibility of white playing d4. Thereby, we rule out the transposition to the Catalan, which means that we have already an independent line at our hands. And here the main move for white is to play queen a4 check to win back the pawn. Should white instead play knight a3, we always take it, after which we gain some time and keep our pawn alive for the time being. So generally white instead goes for queen a4 check. And here is one of the lines that I'm quite happily recommending in the course, one of the lines that I really liked checking and really enjoy being able to present. That is the highly controversial and rare move, queen d7. And from the thousands and thousands of games in this position, queen d7 has only been played a few times. And, well, I wouldn't recommend it just because it's rare. I recommend it mainly because I like it very much. And the reason that I like it is that when white takes on c4, which is the only move, we are able to play c5. And the point with the queen on d7 is that we are able to play knight c6 next. And that is a very harmonious setup. So if we were imagining that we place either the bishop d7, then white takes and the pawn is hanging, so we cannot play c5. Or if we play knight d7, which is the other and most common move, then after queen takes c4, yes, we can play c5, but the knight is not getting to c6, and this knight on d7 is actually quite passive. So that explains the move queen d7, that we're able to play c5 and then get very nice control over the center. Isn't the queen very oddly placed on d7? Doesn't it look stupid? Yes and no. In some sense, yes, it's a bit unnatural, but if we imagine after getting knight c6 that we later on play b6, bishop b7, for instance, then the queen is completely fine on d7. Then it all makes a lot of sense. So it could, if we are not careful, yes, it could turn out to be misplaced. But actually, if we are making the right moves, actually the queen is not at all stupidly placed. It's actually quite nicely placed on d7. So the main thing to keep in mind here as black is after knight f3, knight c6. In general, the main thing to keep track of is to prevent white playing d4 in a good way. So let's say short castle, knight f6, knight c3. In general, we are developing with bishop e7. This is the way. And now if white plays rook d1, we play e5. Very, very important to prevent the move d4. If we don't do this, if we, let's say, would castle, white would play d4 and have actually a very nice advantage. Because after the opening of the center, white will be able to recapture with the knight. This bishop will be very strong. And very, very importantly for the Catalan in general, especially here, this bishop on c8 would not get out. So it's very, very important to get the bishop out. Therefore, always prevent d4. White could try to be tricky and play d4 immediately, actually. It's one of the better moves. Something we should always consider in this setup with the queen on d7. And after the move d4, we take it, rook d1. Now again, if we were to castle, white will recapture the pawn, be very, very happy. But here we do play e5, so the two last moves could have been reversed order for white, but would lead to the same thing. e5 would defend the center, white has to play e3 to try to attack. And now another move that is very, very important for us and is key to our ID is the move d3. So sacrificing back the pawn. Actually, the pawn was lost in any case, but it's important how white regains it. Because if we don't play d3 here, white would take on d4, and it would be similar to what I just described before, that white would very likely be able to trade this knight. The bishop would become a powerhouse on g2, and all white's pieces would be active. But when we play d3, after rook takes d3, we can play queen e6. The trade of queens is quite nice for us. I mean, queen takes e6, bishop takes, we have absolutely no problem. And importantly here, in general, that our bishop on c8 now doesn't really struggle to get out. Like, we will easily, either with a trade or if white moves the queen, then later on we can develop the bishop even to f5 or g4. So we are in that way solving the problem of the bishop. But it's very important that the knight is still on f3 and also the pawn on e3. Because the knight cannot really move. I mean, it doesn't really have any good squares, which means that this bishop on g2 is not as strong as it could have been. And the bishop on c1 is a bit stuck. So very, very important not to let white capture e takes d4, which would solve actually all of these problems. So here, instead of trading, white can also move the queen. And now just avoid playing e4 because of knight g5. You will lose a pawn, so simply castle. Next move, maybe move the queen, then get the bishop out from c8. I guess as white should probably play the move e4, simply in order to develop the bishop and also get this square on d5. And here, I mean, the question is how to develop the pieces. I believe actually here we can do it with tempo or with tempi. First attacking the rook drops back. Actually, d2 looks funny, but the point comes after bishop d7 that white kept the square on d1 for the queen. But it's a rather symmetrical structure. We play rook fd8, and we have absolutely no reason to complain. All our pieces are active. We have no weaknesses. And in general, I would like to just mention one strategic idea, which sounds perhaps very far-fetched, but is actually quite likely to arise in the future. And that is that we end up with, let's say, either a bishop or more likely a knight on d4 against this bishop on g2. That is our dream scenario. So let's say all trades that brings us closer to that are in our favor, because that would leave white's bishop on g2 completely passive and our knight on d4 very, very strong. Sounds completely far-fetched, but actually more likely than you would believe at first sight. So very, very harmonious and pleasant position for black. Just the most important thing, I will say it once again, we always want to prevent d4, or at least prevent white from taking knight takes d4 back. So if white doesn't play d4 immediately, we play e5 to stop it. If white plays like this and then tries to open up, we don't allow e takes d4, we do play d3 and keep white's pieces as passive as possible. But in general, this queen d7 line is very, very nice. And of course, there are much more details in the main chapter, if you're more curious. I also mentioned that instead of bishop g2, it's also possible to start with knight f3, d takes c4, and here there are two options. You could play bishop g2. It's slightly annoying actually for us because we cannot really play c5, or it doesn't work as well as before, because then white plays knight a3 and picks up the c4 pawn with the knight. And I mentioned earlier, if knight a3, we always want to take the knight on a3. So with the pawn on c5, that's not possible. So therefore, we should play knight d7. And the point is, if queen c2, we play knight b6, keeping the pawn alive. And if white plays short castle, then we can develop with knight gf6. And, well, as usual, if white plays knight a3, we take it. We are always happy with this. So most probably white would play queen a4, not to c2 because of knight b6. Now the knight is pinned, but we can play a6. And once, this is very important because once white recaptures, we are able to play b5. The queen is attacked. It has to move somewhere. And then we play bishop b7. Very, very important to get the bishop to b7 in time in order for white's bishop not to get too strong. Now we are basically always able to trade it. And really getting the bishop to b7 is what you need to achieve as black here. It's what will solve all the problems. So as soon as we get the bishop to b7, we are generally speaking completely fine. But we will see a couple of more moves here from a different move order, because white can also play the move queen a4 check. And this is a little bit annoying in regards to what we have seen previously. And the reason why it's annoying is that we would like to play queen d7, get the same line. But after queen takes c4, c5, white has gotten the move knight f3 instead of bishop g2. And that means that white is already ready to play d4. And as I talked about previously, the main goal of our setup in general is to prevent d4. So here, white being able to play it immediately is bad news for us. So that's why queen d7 unfortunately doesn't work as well. So instead we play knight d7. And here, quite an important point is if white recaptures the pawn immediately, now the move to play is very logical because it's a move that solves our greatest problem in general here. By now, you should already actually be able to answer what is our greatest problem. It is this bishop on c8. It has to get out. And here we can play b6. And we do it with white's bishop still on f1 so that white can't put pressure on the long diagonal. And after bishop g2, we are just in time to get our bishop to the long diagonal. And that will solve all our problems. So very, very important. Therefore, more tricky for white would be to play bishop g2. Now b6 cannot really be played. This sort of thing is usually ending up in a disaster. But we play a6, threatening b5 with tempo, and once white captures on c4, we do play b5 with tempo. The queen has to move, and this is what gives us this key extra tempo. Queen c2, bishop b7, just in time before problems started on the long diagonal. And, well, there is only one more thing that I think we should be aware of in this position. Short castle, knight g6. Generally speaking, this is very easy to play. If white does nothing, we play c5. We develop the bishop, we castle. We have no weaknesses. We have no bad pieces. We have plenty of activity and central control. So the only thing we should keep in mind is one idea of white, to attack the pawn on b5. So knight c3, c5, a4. Or if we go back, a4 will transpose c5, knight c3. And this is an important plan actually to be aware of, because we can save the pawn by playing b4, but that is something actually that we should always avoid. That is the main point for white. The main goal for white is to provoke b4, because then this square on c4 becomes very weak. And white is able, for instance, to reroute the knight, get it to c4. And with such nice square on c4, we are always going to suffer a little bit. So basically this position is all about not being forced to play b4. So we have to defend the pawn. The most common move is queen b6. But I prefer actually to defend the pawn with bishop c6. It looks a little bit strange, but the point is after a takes b5, a takes, our queen defends the rook on a8. And that is actually quite useful because the queen will be excellent on a8. First of all, the bishop can stay on c6, and also we get pressure on the long diagonal, for instance. Just in general, it makes things a bit easier. So bishop c6 still a bit rarer than queen b6, but I believe much simpler as a solution. Here, in order for white to achieve anything, it's really the same question. Like white has to try to get us to move the b pawn. Otherwise, we simply develop and we are fine. So one way to do it is knight e1. This is actually recommended by Nityrlis in his new book about the English by Quality Chess. Very nice book. But yeah, understandably, he doesn't get very far against this line because it has been known for a long time to be fine. Which he also, by the way, admits. I'm not trying to argue. Bishop takes g2. King takes g2. Basically, the point for white is like this trade of bishops is generally speaking in our favor. But in this case, it's really still all about the move pawn on b5. By trading one defender, white is trying to force us to move the pawn, trying to achieve this big strategic goal. But actually, we don't need to move it anyway still. One way to avoid it is to play rook b8, just keeping b5 defended. The only downside of this is that after the capture, white does have the a-file. So, quite possible, still very, very solid. But the most, let's say, maximalistic move for black, the maximalist approach, not trying to give white even the a-file, giving white absolutely nothing, is to move c4. And the point is that we are able to play a b4 on the next move because we have the pawn on c4. So let's say white makes a move. I don't know. Let's say yes, to explain, white makes a waiting move. Then after b4, knight d1, we are able to play rook c8. The pawn on c4 is kept alive. And that means that white will not get access to the c4 square for a knight. Whereas if we play b4 immediately, knight d1, we are not in time to prevent knight e3, knight c4. Finally, white establishes this very beautiful knight. So c4 creates a small strategic threat, actually, of b4. That probably white should deal with this threat by taking on b5 before we play b4. We take back. We are not losing the pawn on b5 because the rook is hanging, and if white takes, then we recapture with check. So everything is under control. White can play knight f3, that's the most natural. Here, b4 is perhaps a little bit early due to knight b5. So, more solid is to play queen a6. Simply defending the pawn chain. Maybe we can play later on b4 without white being able to play knight b5. So, basically, the position is completely fine. We are slightly behind in development, yes. That's true, but on the other hand, white is unable to open the position quickly, and we will be able to finish our development in due time. So, for instance, if white plays d3, it's quite important not to take, because after queen takes, white gets pressure. But we do have a much stronger move in the form of b4. And the good news here with the queen on a6, first of all, knight b5 is prevented, but also when white retreats the knight to b1, then we can take on d3. Because after queen takes d3, our queen on a6 makes it possible for us to trade queens, and even forcing white a slight weakness on d3. So such an ending, I mean, I would say that it's actually just equal. Like at first, when I saw this, I thought black was even a bit better, because this square is really fantastic for the knight. White will be able to do nothing about it. But on the other hand, white has one square on c4, and this pawn on b4 is also slightly weak. Not that it will drop off anytime soon or anything like that, but it's just a little bit annoying to have it that. So in fact, the ending is, I guess, just quite equal, but very, very easy to play. We play castle. We activate the rook, maybe to c8 or somewhere. It's hard to say, but basically there is no reason why we should have any problems. Like the d5 square is enough to compensate for all of the other factors. So this concludes this part with the sort of Catalan without d4. Important choice for white whether to play knight f3 or bishop g2, but not that much to keep track of. So this leads us to the next line, which is knight f3 immediately. And this is a little bit different because after d5, okay, white can transpose with c4, after which we play e6. But the independent move is the move g3. And this is an interesting way for white to play, especially against the queen's gambit declined in general. Because were we to play e6 now, white would not play c4 immediately. White would first play bishop g2 and castle, and only later c4. Then maybe even d4. And again, if we allow that, we are very likely ending up in a Catalan that is not within our repertoire. So we are very likely to getting tricked. And therefore, we need an independent option here. So in the Slav chapter, I recommend the move knight d7. And, well, it's a completely independent move. It leads to independent lines, independent positions. So you can definitely play it if you like that chapter. But for Queen's Gambit declined players, I believe the move b6 is making a whole lot of sense, especially with our repertoire. And the point is, of course, to get the bishop to b7 in general. But more specifically, the point is that if white were to play bishop g2, then we are immediately ready to play bishop b7. So if we were to play, let's say, knight f6, bishop g2, b6, then white would play c4. And if we take it, then, for instance, knight e5, and we are not getting our bishop to b7 in time. And that is very, very important, because getting the bishop to the long diagonal is really one of the key things for black in this entire opening. And therefore, playing b6 already on move 2, although it's very, very rare, I believe it makes a lot of sense, because it's really kind of solving one of our main, or the main strategic issue already on move 2, basically. I mean, white can always play d4 in these lines. In this case, after e6, we are transposing immediately to the Magnus Queen's Gambit. Very simple play there. We play bishop b7. As soon as c4, we always take it. Otherwise, we simply develop our pieces. White could also play c4, which I think personally is the most likely, or also the best move, let's say. No, more likely, I'm not sure. It's a bit hard for me to say. I think on higher levels, it's more likely. It's also what I played myself, so that's part of why I think it's likely. But also, when you look at the strong players, they generally tend to play c4. On lower levels, I think bishop g2 will be equally likely. But again, anyway, against c4, what we want to do, what is our idea, is always to take. And again, we do this with the idea to play bishop b7 and the pose on the long diagonal next. So if white now were to play queen a4 check, we block with knight d7 in order to keep the bishop on the long diagonal next. So for instance, queen takes c4, e6 is already transposing. This we have seen already. And if knight e5, which is another idea that you should be getting used to, then bishop b7, knight c6, and it looks very nice for white with the knight on c6. We have to go queen c8, but it's a phenomena that you will see quite a lot in this line. This knight, yes, it looks nice, but it's not really attacking anything that bothers us very much, and eventually, bit by bit, we will be able to trade it off. So in this case, for instance, after bishop g2, we play e6. Let's say queen takes c4. We already are able to play knight e7. Next move, white can't prevent us from trading the knights. And once we trade the knights, white's like temporary initiative, let's say, will be gone. So just to show you one more funny trick, that if white plays d4, we trade, bishop takes. And now we want to get rid of the bishop on c6. But the way to do it, I mean, there is a very nice way to do it, basically. By the help of a small tactical trick. I mean, if this trick didn't exist, then bishop d6 followed by castle and eventually slowly getting rid of the bishop would also be fine. But in this specific instance, the move bishop c5 is even nicer. And the point is, well, if white takes the bishop, then c6 is hanging. And if white takes, then after queen takes b7, white doesn't have time to take on c5 because the rook on h1 is hanging. And if white castles, then we can retreat the bishop. Now there is no longer an annoying piece on c6. And in the future, we will play short castle. And then strategically, for the middle game, our plan will be either to push c5, or I think even more likely to push e5, fight back in the center. And well, again, without bad pieces, white has a slight space advantage. But after e5 or c5, this space advantage will also disappear. So basically, no bad pieces, no weaknesses, and enough counterplay. No reason whatsoever to complain. But it's just important in general that you don't get nervous about this, let's say, knight sitting on c6 for a while, because eventually we will be able to trade it off. So no need to get nervous there. There is also another move here, which I think is quite likely to be played. That is the move knight to a3, in order to take back with the knight. And here, of course, our pawn is on e7, which means that we are not able to take on a3. So we have to continue with natural development. Bishop b7, knight takes c4. We play knight d7. I mean, always to d7 with the knight, because this bishop should be kept open, so no knights on c6. Bishop g2, e6, very natural development, short castle. And here actually is one of the very few moments in this line where we'd have to be a little bit precise. And we have to anticipate white's idea and make a small move to prevent it. Because the most natural move would be knight g to f6. This is generally part of our setup. It's generally how we want to develop. But in this specific instance, white can play knight c5, creating a tactical threat of knight takes f7. King takes f7, knight g5 check, and this bishop is hanging. And once we take, this would be our normal reaction. Normally speaking, I would say that we are doing quite well now. Knight takes, bishop takes g2. If white recaptures, we can even give a check, forcing this knight back. We are completely fine. But here, there is an annoying intermediate move, queen a4 check. Now, we don't want to retreat with knight d7. That would be quite passive. So the one move that looks very good, looks very smart, is b5, with the point after queen takes b5 to play c6, attacking the queen, and white doesn't have time to regain the bishop on g2. So we win a piece, or not. Well, in this specific situation, white has this surprising idea of queen b7, threatening checkmate on f7, and while we block it, white regains the piece and has won a pawn with an overwhelming advantage. So, for this reason, in this position, we should not play knight gf6. We should instead play the move bishop to e7. And, well, the reason for this move is only connected to the previous line. That's the only reason. So if white now were to play the same, knight takes, bishop takes g2. This is all exactly the same as the previous line. Again, if white recaptures, we give the check. We are completely fine. So queen a4 check. Again, this smart move b5, hitting the queen. Queen takes b5, c6. If the queen moves anywhere else, then we save our bishop. So white plays queen b7. But now we see the difference. There is a bishop on e7. This bishop prevents queen takes f7 mate, which means that we can just move our bishop out of the way and we will remain a piece up. So very, very advanced stuff, very advanced move order, but also the move bishop e7 in itself is part of our setup. It's a very simple way to solve a problem while still making very good moves. Just a little bit of a nerdy detail there for you. Instead, white can play many other things. For instance, d4 would be quite natural, grabbing space in the center, but this is really what we are trying to achieve in the entire line. Knight gf6, bishop f4, let's say. We just castle. Let's say white plays rook c1, we play rook c8. This is our setup. Next up, we probably, I mean, long term, the plan is definitely to play c5. That's our main idea, to fight back in the center. Currently, perhaps it can be met by knight d6. So what we do most probably want to do is to play knight d5 first, hitting the bishop, kicking it back, and then we are ready to play c5. But there is no real rush. The most important thing is that our bishop is on b7. So any tricks on the long diagonal will not work. We are very, very solid and absolutely no reason to complain. So that's a bit about c4, which I think is quite likely. The other main move for white here is bishop g2. We again play bishop b7, very, very important. If c4 we want to take, and then we need the bishop on b7 to avoid problems on the long diagonal. So instead white castles, or could castle, we play e6. And here there is a big choice for white, which pawn to push. One typical way for these Reddit players, how they often like to play, is to play b3. A sort of double fianchetto, knight f6, bishop b2. And here we should be a little bit careful again, because if we play this bishop d6, then white plays c4, let's say something like this, short castle, knight c3. We have seen something similar before. I will say the same thing here, basically, that it's possible to play this setup. It's a setup you will be well familiar with, but it's a lot more solid for black if white has already taken on d5, already committed to that structure. Now white can keep a bit more flexible. I'm still actually giving it as an alternative in the main chapter, because it's not, I mean, it also makes sense to play. It's not so bad, and it's like you are very familiar with the structures and so on. But again, in this sort of, let's say, in order to play in the most precise fashion, and also to make sure that we are 100% equalizing, which I feel an obligation to do. After all, this is a lifetime repertoire. I'm also giving the move bishop e7 as the most solid try. So not perhaps the simplest. This is requiring a little bit more concrete knowledge, but definitely a very, very solid and clean equalizer for black. So c4, short castle. Now if white plays knight c3, we play c5. You will probably recognize this setup, because after e3, which prevents d4, then we are playing queen c8, and this is a direct transposition to what we have seen earlier. The point is rook d8, then play knight c6, and always recapture with a piece on d5. Never with a pawn. But white can also take immediately, which makes things a little bit different. We, again, always want to recapture with a piece, so we take with the knight. d4. And here, well, basically white can play slower moves as well, but then we play as play c5, knight c6, and we have no issues whatsoever. So the critical way for white is to play d4, the most ambitious way, in order to later on play e4. Here it's possible to play c5, which is quite solid, but I advocate the move knight d7. I think it's the best move, simply. Now, actually, e4 looks tempting, but I think actually it's a little bit of a strategic mistake. And the reason is, after knight f6, we have lots of pressure on the e4 pawn. So much pressure that, in fact, the pawn has to move forward. Then we simply retreat. We have given white two moves for free, but white has been forced to play e4, e5, which means that this square on d5 will be ours for eternities. White will never be able to do anything about it. And that's actually a very, very important strategic factor. Next up, we can simply attack the center with c5 and just... I mean, it's not even so important what we do. It's just important that we have this knight on d5 that will provide us with all the stability we need, and also all the counterplay that we need. So white really, really wants to keep the pawn on e4. And in order to do that, the best way is to start with rook e1. The point comes after our most natural reply c5, which is what we want to do. Then e4. We move the knight to f6, and here, because the rook is already on e1, white can play knight c3, defending the pawn twice. So That's the reason why rook e1 has to be played first. And this is actually an important moment, because now white has kind of gotten what they wanted. And if we do nothing special, we might end up a bit worse. White has two good bishops, both fianchetto quite nicely placed, and also quite nice control in the center. So here we need to actually do something quickly. And that can be done by taking on d4. Knight takes d4. And here, the move bishop to c5 is very, very important. Creating threats along this diagonal, trying to make the knight on d4 a bit less stable. And on the next move, is if given the chance, we really want to play knight e5, further increasing the pressure. So, for instance, one line is rook e2, knight e5, which is covered in the main chapter. Here, I will mention the move knight a4, hitting the bishop. We move the bishop. We don't want to give up the bishop pair in general in this line. The rook moves to e2. And another important concept for us in this line in general is that trades are in our favor, because white is the one with the space advantage. In this specific situation, we can play knight c5, trading the knights like this. And after the trade of knights, we have enough space for all our pieces, and basically we are quite comfortable. Should white play rook d2, we can simply move the queen away. Next up, rook fd8, maybe rook ac8. All our pieces are good. And without these extra knights on c3 and d7, this lack of space is not really felt. Additionally, this pawn is hanging a bit. And yeah, this extra trade on knight really makes it much, much easier for us. And we have basically solved all our problems quite easily. But it's important to know, and it's also important, especially this position, to act quickly, take on d4, play bishop c5, go for knight e5 is given the chance to get this counterplay against the white center before white is able to stabilize. So apart from that, apart from the double fianchetto, there is also the move d3, which I imagine would be quite likely for King's Indian attack players. But on the other hand, such sort of slow measures are rarely enough to create real problems for us. We play knight f6. Knight bd2 would be the King's Indian attack move. And here our setup is, well, I'm giving actually the move bishop c5 as well in the main chapter as an alternative to spice things up a little bit. But the solid and simple way is knight bd7. And the idea is after e4, we always take on e4. It's the same thing as before. If c4, we will also take on c4 always. So e4, d takes e4. And now if white should take back on e4, which is arguably the most natural move, we don't take on e4 because white would get a lot of counterplay quickly in the center. White would trade, get the tempo with queen e2, pin us with rook d1, bishop g5 would also come with tempo. I mean, it's all quite unnecessary. I mean, it's possible to defend and even keep maybe the extra pawn, but white has definitely full compensation, and also the style of play is quite unpleasant for black, I think. So what we do want to do instead is to simply play e5, and this is our setup. And that's why we put the knight on d7. And this is actually very, very solid. So our idea is to play bishop c5, short castle, and then we have absolutely nothing to complain about, only good pieces remaining. So this is really a nice way. White can also play the move knight g5, which has been the most common in practice. Here, if you want to trade everything off, you can play knight c5, and when white takes on e4, you trade it all. It will be quite droish. If you want to keep some more pieces, I think the move bishop e7 makes sense. And after white recaptures the pawn on e4, just very importantly, don't forget that white is threatening to take on f6 with the b7 bishop hanging. So the solution is very calm. We play rook b8, simply defending the bishop. And these sort of positions are actually quite comfortable for us. We can castle next. After our king is in safety, for instance, play c5, queen c7 is one possible idea. What else? I mean, maybe the rook goes to d8 later on. If we are feeling very ambitious, maybe even at some point move the knight on d5 to d5 in order to play f5, push this knight away. It depends a little bit on what white is doing, but also one of the main things is that it's hard for white to do anything at all, because we have such a solid position and white's pawns are quite far behind. So just a very, very solid position, but with some potential to take over later on. But the most important thing, just recapture, capture on e4 or c4 whenever white plays it. That, I think, concludes this part, leaves us with some of the sidelines. I think by far the most important is the move b3, d5, bishop b2, and here in the Slav section, I recommend the move bishop g4, which I think makes a lot of sense also for Queen's Gambit declined players. And to be honest, me myself, in my practical experience, long before I learned to play the Slav, I anyway played bishop g4 here in my own games. So definitely possible also for Queen's Gambit declined players. So if you are curious, you should have a look there. But if we really want to keep the game in real Queen's Gambit declined waters, then I believe knight f6 makes the most sense. Knight f3 and now e6. So the same setup against everything. And here, for instance, if white plays e3, we play b6. As soon as e3 comes, as a rule of thumb, it makes sense to play b6, because then this idea with c4, c takes d5 is less dangerous. The pawn is already committed to e3. So the more critical way for white to play instead of that, I mean, for instance, c4, and we will transpose to what we have seen with bishop b7 already. White will take on d5 and play g3, or keep the tension, but we have already seen it. So the sort of independent option is c4. Here again, if you want to, you can play b6, and again we get this position with g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop d6, short castle. White will play knight c3 and then not take on d5, so white has this extra flexibility. But on the other hand, we are still very solid, and it's still the same setup. So I mean, I'm repeating myself that this is definitely a viable option if you want to sort of cut down your workload a little bit while still being very familiar with what you are doing. If we want the independent option, if we don't want to give white even a millimeter of hope for an advantage, let's say, we should play the move bishop to d6. And now white has an important choice, the usual choice in general for the whole course. Should the bishop be developed with e3, or should it be developed with g3? And here, well, e3 makes a lot of sense. Now again, we have the question. I think b6 here is slightly imprecise, because after knight c3, with the bishop on d6, white is immediately threatening knight b5. And if we play a6, then white can again play g3, go for this setup, or even actually play g4, and our setup is a little bit slow. So definitely possible to play. But if we are going for this sort of maximalist approach, I believe short castle is making more sense. Knight c3, a6. And the difference here is if white goes for instance, some shenanigans with g4, some very aggressive stuff, then we can play b5 in one move, getting a lot of counterplay and basically not having wasted a move on the slightly slow b6. So we are trying to fight against white's most aggressive options. By delaying b6, we are keeping extra flexibility. And if white plays something like d4, then we are playing b6, and then we are sort of back into known territory, let's say. Here, white could play bishop d3. This is again very likely transposing to the Magnus Queen's Gambit. Bishop b7, short castle, knight bd7 is a position reached in the 4e3 chapter, where it's analyzed quite a lot. If white wants to keep the thing independent, the move g3 makes sense. Again, the bishop is generally speaking better on g2. I mean, white could also take on d5 and then play g3, but then we have this structure where white is already committed a little bit earlier, and even more committed due to having placed the pawn on d4 already. So most likely transposing, but to something quite comfortable for us. So g3 is the independent option. Bishop b7, bishop g2, knight bd7, short castle. Again, on any move, if white takes, we happily recapture with the e-pawn, transposing to this comfortable position. But now we are kind of running out of normal moves, and white is still keeping this flexibility. So I believe if we want to, let's say, play in the concrete equalizing manner instead of just playing the position, I mean, basically we always have this option, play the position or going for something a little bit more direct. And in this case, if we want to go for something a little bit more direct, then I believe d takes c4 is the way to do it. B takes c4, and our idea is to play c5. And the point of this is to attack both of these two pawns. We want to take on d4, then they would both be weak. That would actually be already probably better for us. So the critical way for white here is to play d5, advancing in the center. E takes d5. And now very important for white, if white takes with the pawn, then we play b5, which is our main idea. And this is actually great for us, because now we have b4, which would win this pawn, but we also have another very important idea, c4, with idea knight c5, knight d3. And both of these will give us quite a nice initiative, actually. So white actually should take with the knight first, just to open up for the bishop, but also sort of eliminating, like sort of evacuating the knight from the c3 square, so it doesn't get under attack. Knight takes d5, c takes d5, and a very interesting structure has arisen. We have a big majority on the queen side. White has a big majority in the center. So we push b5. White pushes e4. White wants to play e5. So we prevent it with rook e8, sorry. Now the pawn is hanging. White should defend it probably with rook e1. And the key idea here for us, like we don't want white to sort of undisturbed play e5, then white would get quite a strong initiative. It's very important to have a clear, let's say, solution in mind should white do that. And the solution in this case, why we actually included the move rook e8, rook e1, is that we play c4. Okay, in itself, a very natural move. We talked about it earlier as well. This is one good plan. Also b4 and c3 is simply pushing the pawns. Very, very good plan. But the point more specifically here is after e5, we do have this extra option of bishop b4 hitting the rook on e1, but also getting ready to play c3. And by this, we are getting excellent counterplay. And here, there are actually quite a few more lines in the main chapter. They are quite interesting to study, but I think for a quick starter, this is already, I mean, maybe even a little bit more than enough for something that is quite unlikely to happen. But once you get going, once you have started to try out the repertoire, you have maybe a couple of games in this, you might want to study also the main chapter for more details about this, because the lines are really interesting and actually quite tempting for black to play, let's say. But yeah, very important idea for black to take on c4 and play c5 if white refrains from trading on d5 earlier on. But in general, I would say this idea of playing g3 without taking on d5 is actually quite rare, and I do believe it's quite unlikely that you will face it. The other move for white here, which I think is quite likely as well to be played, is the move g3. It's, of course, my opinion is that the bishop is slightly better on g2 than on e2 in general, so therefore I consider it the most critical move. It's, by the way, also the move that Adiban recommends in his course. So all those g3 cowboys out there might want to play this against you. And the reason, I mean, the idea in general is to get the previous lines, but not even committing to e3. So white is trying to get sort of the maximalist version. And for us, we don't, I mean, again, you can still play this b6, bishop b7, then you might as well have done it on the previous move, on move 4. But here, in order to keep it independent and to, let's say, not give white this typical position, we do play c5. And our argument here is that double fianchettoing the bishops is a little bit slow in regards to the fight for the center, and therefore we are trying to take over the center. Now, we're also actually creating a serious strategic threat, because if bishop g2, then we play d4, and then this bishop on b2 is actually completely out of the game. It puts pressure on d4, but it doesn't matter because we can always defend it with e5, even if white attacks it with e3. White will never be able to break this pawn chain, which means that this bishop on b2 will always be a terrible piece. And although I'm not a big fan in general of these reversed Benoni structures, I think when there is such a misplaced piece as the bishop on b2, I mean, we should simply go for it. It would be an offense not to make use of the opportunity, let's say. So, I mean, white is definitely not equalizing there even. So, because of that, the best move for white is to take on d5. E takes d5 and only now bishop g2. Because now if d4, we don't have this other pawn on e6 to support the center. So if we play d4, which is still possible and perfectly viable, then at least after e3, like white gets serious counterplay in the center. So instead, we castle. Now white can either castle, knight c6, d4. This is the same as if white plays d4 first. We take and play rook e8. And white might as well play d4 immediately. Leads to the same thing after c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, short castle necessary at some point, and rook e8. And the reason why we play rook e8 is, well, the rook is very natural on the open file. It puts pressure. On e2, it's just in general useful. But also, we are not yet completely sure where the other pieces go. Like, most probably, we want to place our bishop on g4. But it's not entirely certain, and we keep flexible. Maybe it should stay on c8 for a while. So we start with the move that we know for sure that we want to play, so we keep this most flexible way. Here, in the main chapter, we have a couple of different options for white. One is knight c3. The downside of this move is that we can take on d4 and play bishop e5, which shows another great point with having the rook on e8. If white does something random, another possible idea for us is to play h5, h4. This is a very good way to create some counterplay. I mean, we do have this weak pawn on d5, so we do need, let's say, some counterplay to compensate for that. But actually, we don't need that much, because first of all, this pawn on d5 is, I mean, white is not really threatening to take it, or it's not weak per se, like in the sense that it will maybe get lost soon. But it's a long-term weakness. We need some long-term plans, at least, to compensate for that. And one is h5, h4. One is this taking on d4 and playing bishop e5 to create pressure on the other diagonal. And finally, if white plays something like knight d2, which is very logical, then we can develop the bishop to g4. Now with the rook on e8, we do create a concrete threat of knight takes d4, followed by bishop takes e2. And should white place the knight on f3, which is very, very normal and very likely, then we can make use of the fact that white no longer controls the e4 square. Just put the knight on e4. For instance, rook c1, queen b6. And it's true that the two knights for white are safely blockading our d-pawn, but our idea was never so much to advance the d-pawn in any case. Our idea is more to play with the pieces. And having the knights on f3 and d4 actually gives us complete freedom, because now the pawn on d5 is not hanging at all. So we can play queen b6, we can follow up with bishop c5, which would create pressure along this diagonal. Also just bringing the last rook to the game. And like all in all, we are so active and all our pieces are healthy, and it's very hard for white to put any sort of pressure on us. And therefore, I believe that the position is quite comfortable for black to play. And I would certainly don't mind it. But this concludes the Quickstarter guide. I hope you have gotten a feeling for how the game might develop. You have gotten some knowledge about the most likely things that your opponents will do. And of course, I encourage you to try it out in your games. I encourage you to get going immediately. And then, of course, bit by bit, when you get the time, when you get some experience maybe with games, you should of course, switch to studying the main part of the repertoire to get all those extra details, all those extra plans, and so on. So basically, for now, I will just say good luck and see you in the main chapters. Thank you very much.